we're back. So I'm going to show you this. First of all, I always work in degrees, and then I'm going to convert my answer to radians from that. In the calculator, it'll give you the radians as a decimal, which is not attractive. You need to have your answer for an angle as like pi over 4, pi over 5, 3 pi over 4, and it's going to give you decimals like 7.29954, and you're not going to know what that means. So I'm going to stay in degrees, just like that. And on your calculator, whatever you're using, just make sure it's in degree mode. And to do the inverse sine of 0, you just do inverse sine 0. And I got 0. So it's 0 degrees, 0 radians. And 0 lives in that interval, so I'm okay. Now I'm going to do the inverse tangent of square root of 3. So second tangent square root of 3. Gave me 60 degrees. Now, 60 degrees in radians is just pi over 3. See, that's not difficult. So where's the tangent square root of 3? At pi over 3. So the arc cosine of -1, that just means to do the inverse cosine of -1, 180 degrees. Well, 180 degrees is pi radians, and that works because pi is included in our domain. Now it's going to get a little tricky because the secant is -2. Do you understand that? Therefore, the cosine is -1/2. Flip this guy. Flip the answer and use your reciprocal because we don't have an inverse secant button, but we do have an inverse cosine. So now I'm going to do inverse cosine, -1 divided by 2. I have 120 degrees. And if you multiply that by pi over 180, that's 2 pi over 3. All right, the arctan of negative square root of 3. So we'll do second inverse tan, negative square root 3 gives me -60. -60 degrees times pi over 180 gives me negative pi over 3, which lives in that interval, so we're okay. All right, so for number 6, inverse sine negative square root of 3 divided by 2 is -60, which we already know from the one above is negative pi over 3 in radians. So here we go. Inverse cosine, number 7. Inverse cosine of square root of 3 divided by 2 is 30 degrees. You can also look on your unit circle, couldn't you? Which is pi over 6 in radians. All right, inverse sine of negative square root of 2 divided by 2 is -45. Multiplied by pi over 180 gives you negative pi over 4. All right. So now these last 4, these are where it gets a little tricky. I hope you can see them. The inverse cotangent, we do not have an inverse cotangent button, so you have to flip the answer. So we're going to change this to the inverse tangent of -1 over square root of 3. I hope that makes sense. So here we go. Inverse tangent, -1 divided by the square root of 3, -30. Which in radians, negative pi over 6. The arc cosecant, well, we can't do the cosecant. We don't have that button, so we're going to do the arc sine And we're going to flip -1, which is just going to be -1/1, correct? So we'll just do the inverse sine of -1. We get -90. And hopefully you know by now that that's -pi/2. All right, so we cannot do the arc secant, but we can do the arc cosine of -1 divided by square root of 2. So here we go with that. So we'll do inverse cosine. Notice how I interchange those words of -1 divided by the square root of 2. 135. Multiply that by pi/180, and you're going to get 3pi/4, which that lives in my cosine interval, so we are good.